Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Tam Morris, and I will be chairing the next panel. Now, before I start, just really quickly, we have an overly experienced panel. Now, I'm going to give a very short introduction. Please do not take my short introduction to their level of experience. I don't want to waste all the time just sitting there going through what they've done. But starting us off with the panel is His Eminence, the Ambassador, and I'm going to try to pronounce your surname, Miro Chenko. Did I get close? Oh, thank you. I actually spent on the phone call with a friend of mine from Ukraine for 5 minutes, and he kept saying it to me over and over again, and then laughed at me at the end and just said, give up. His Eminence has been ambassador to Australia since April 1st, 2022. Before that, he was a partner of CFC Big Ideas, which is a Kiev-based strategic communications company. Since then, he's been a member of the supervisory board of the Ukrainian Institute, which is a cultural diplomacy outfit for the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Ukraine. He's also the co-founder of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and was the head of the board of the Professional Government Association, which is an NGO uniting Ukrainian alumni in assistance in economic, legal, and judicial reforms in the Ukraine. Second up, we have Professor Kimberly Trapp from University College of London. Professor Trapp is an expert in public international law. Not going to lie, I've read a lot of her papers. She has published and presented on issues relating on use of force, state responsibility, international humanitarian law, terrorism suppression, and the settlement of international disputes. Professor Trapp is an academic advisor on issues of international humanitarian law and human rights law with various NGOs and government departments. She's the co-editor of the Elements of International Law book series, and is a member of the Academic Review Board for the Cambridge International Law Journal, Board of Editors for the Journal of the Use of Force in International Law, and serves on an advisory board of the McGill Journal of International Law and Legal Pluralism. And finally, we have our very own Professor Mary Kroc, who is a professor here, who's an absolute expert in anything to do with immigration, citizenship, and refugee law, also disability rights, administrative, constitutional law, public international law. Her publications include leading texts on Australian immigration and refugee law, specifically with the interactions between disability, migration, and human rights law. Her research has been cited multiple times in the Australian Federal Courts and the High Court, and she has given evidence and has attended hearings as an advisor to the Australian Senate, a consultant to the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, and a consultant to the Royal Commission in Child Sex Abuse. But to stop talking now, I would like to pass on to our first speaker, looking at a Ukrainian perspective on the Russian aggression in Ukraine, His Excellency Ambassador Miro Chenko.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Happy to be here. And of course, a lot to reflect on, a lot to talk about. And thanks a lot for inviting me here to this discussion. Just as a disclaimer, I'm not an international lawyer, though I've studied international law as part of my education for my undergraduate and master's degrees in Kiev, where I studied IR, which was pretty much mostly about history of the 20th century. But then there was a lot of theory, and then we had international law and others. And then pretty much the past 20 years, I was in the private sector, but I've always remained very close to foreign affairs, to international public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, investment promotion, and other topics. And of course, I studied international trade at the LSE, so I was very happy to hear remarks from a professor from my British alma mater. So it was an interesting discussion, and I have a lot to reflect on, actually. And I look forward to other discussions we're going to have on this panel. And look, I don't know where to start, because on one hand, you sort of follow the news. You're all intelligent people. You know what's going on, right? So I shouldn't be telling you what's going on. To give you kind of a perspective from a legal standpoint of view doesn't matter, because you are more experts than I am, right? But I think what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to, share with you. And sometimes, when you get in this kind of discussions, it's kind of difficult. And this is where, referring to a professor, how can you stay kind of impartial, not emotional? How can you kind of look at the matter, subject matter, and especially in academic circles, that's kind of a bit of a challenge, because at the end of the day, when you see your country destroyed, when you see your civilian infrastructure destroyed, when you see, how many educational buildings were destroyed, 2,200 of those, by the way, including university schools, up to 500 hospitals were destroyed. 50% of Ukraine's energy system is gone. Electricity distribution is disrupted. Most of the country is in blackouts, continuously blacked out, right? So just one of the examples of the Russian war crimes by targeting civilians and targeting civilian infrastructure, right? The problem is that, you know, especially when we talk about, you know, different approaches to international law and, you know, legal fundamentalism or tradition of dispute settlement, diplomacy, all of that. It's a good discussion, worthwhile discussion. What is often missing, and I hope it's going to be here at this conference. So what's the solution? How do we get out of it, right? How to solve it, right? Historical perils are terrible. I think this is just never use them. I think this is just awful, right? And for many different reasons, because whatever the world was in 1918, whatever the world was in 1939, and even worse, 1962, I think this is just, this is exactly what Professor referred to, because is international law more of a power of language? And this is something that I know a bit about, the power of language. Because the way you can spin it is just phenomenal, and kind of what emotion you want to elicit. And just one of the examples. You know, we're discussing here, and here's you know, conflict in Ukraine. What is conflict in Ukraine? Even this particular thing, conflict in Ukraine, like if you don't know anything about it, there must be some sort of conflict in Ukraine between Russian-speaking, maybe Ukrainian-speaking people, right? Probably could be an internal conflict, right? Because even the term conflict in Ukraine already sends you a wrong message, right? Because it's not a conflict. There's no conflict in Ukraine. There's never been a conflict in Ukraine. There's only Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russian aggression in Ukraine. This is what has happened. And look, I'm not, you know, this is not like, I know how it's been used in media and everything and everywhere, right? But even like this, I was stunned. I mean, there is Russian war in Ukraine. There's Russian war. It's not Ukraine war. It's Russian war. So I think it's all should be termed Russian war, because it was not Ukraine who started that. It was Russia who started. It's Russian war. Especially when you get to all these international different organizations. I've recently spoken at a fundraiser which was raising money for UNHCR for the Ukrainians, right? And you get this representative of the UNHCR in Australia speaking, right? And in her speech, she doesn't even mention Russia there. And then all of a sudden you see these reports, 64 missiles, you know, were fired at Ukraine and they just landed. So not even a mention that where they came from. It looks like a weather forecast, you know. Today, we only had 32 missiles, which hit, you know, different targets in Ukraine. Not even a mention of where they came from and why they came from. It looks like, you know, God just sends them over because it's just kind of a weather forecast, right? And this is you know, if, you know, sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional, but it's very important, right? And 1962, let me just tell you what's behind it, right? Russians are very skillful at manipulating, right? So they've been behind that peril about 1962, and let me tell you why, right? So it's very simple. So they want you to believe that we're on the brink of the nuclear war, which is going to bring down the whole world down. Therefore, you need to sit down and negotiate. And for Russians, negotiations means that, you know, Ukraine surrenders, they're going to grab whatever they grabbed, and that's it, right? And we just go on from that. Russia is going to just basically need time, because they need time to actually beef up their military, like they've done 9 years ago. You know, act of aggression happened 9 years ago in 2014. The war started 9 years ago, right? So they use the time and they use the high prices for commodities to beef up their military to mount an attack in 2022, right? They built Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. They figured that the West depends on the Russian supply of gas so much there will be no unity. Kyiv would fall in 5 days. They would get a puppet government. Ukraine's sovereignty will be actually violated and probably dissolved eventually by integrating Ukraine into the Eurasian Russian Union, whatever you name it. And then everybody would just live with that, right? Because Russia got nuclear weapons, right? And 1962 is exactly what Kremlin wants you to think. We were on the brink of the nuclear war, but then we stopped and we negotiated. Let's negotiate. Have you seen the remarks from Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, yesterday? He said, oh, Biden is going to be here in Poland. Why doesn't he come to Minsk and I facilitate his meeting with Vladimir Putin? So why do you think it's happening, right? And I think this is a power language, because by eliciting that emotion in about 1962, you're basically saying, look, I mean, this war, everybody's getting tired of this war. There's so much fatigue, people are suffering, politicians, they're tired of it. They want to get back to normal. That's what Putin is betting on, right? Because Putin is looking at all these democratically elected presidents, prime ministers. He's seen many of them in 22 years. He thinks you're weak because, look, just look, Boris Johnson is a great friend of Ukraine, but he looks at him, oh, well, you had to step down because I had a party during COVID. Who are you, right? I mean, for Putin, let's put it this way, right? This is hilarious for them there in the Kremlin, watching how these European democratically elected leaders have to step down because of a party, right? Or something, which of course for us who are building democracy, we all understand why it's happening, right? We all understand it in a free world why it's happening. But at the same time, for the Kremlin, they believe that the democracies are weak and there is a new model for development, which is authoritarian kind of development, modeled around China, modeled around, Russian way of doing it. But we have to go back to the question, what's the solution? How do we get out of this, right? I get this question all this time. How long this war is going to last? What's your prediction, right? I don't know. Nobody knows, right? Maybe it's going to end tomorrow. We wake up and the main man is gone and it's going to just fall apart like a house of cards. And everybody will say, wow, we've always been with Ukraine. We've been out there. But, from an international law standpoint of view, I mean, it's like a very complicated issue. But I think the reason why you have so many students in your politics of international law also comes from the fact what's been happening in the world for the past 9 years. And of course, Russian invasion of Ukraine is probably one of the most fascinating kind of cases to look at from a standpoint of international law, right? Because there are so many different aspects of that, right? And a special tribunal on the act of aggression, how we proceed with that, how many countries who've already signed up to that, how do we create it, what's going to be a model, what's the role of the UN General Assembly, how can we incorporate the decisions of the Parliamentary Assembly on the Council of Europe, can we take into account some of the resolutions taken in the European Parliament, right? So it's all becoming part of the bigger puzzle, right? How do we go about it? What model we use, right? Is it kind of Sierra Leone model? Is it Yugoslavia model kind of thing? So look, I mean, and then, it's probably has to be something new because it's a very kind of unusual thing when a nuclear power, violates a country next door. And, just from a historic point of view, it's interesting what's happening. As you know, Ukraine had one of the largest stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the world, right? In 1994, we unilaterally gave them up, right? It never happened in the history of the world, right? So we've seen all other countries gaining nuclear weapons, like Pakistan and India developing their nuclear capabilities. Ukraine gave it up, right, along with Kazakhstan. Sent it over to Russia, destroyed our strategic bombers. There was a big picture out of it, We can, it's not about the history of that, but that's an important element. And then we've signed a document which now they say was not really a legal document, it was just assurances that were not guarantees. Nobody really guaranteed you anything, right? And all of a sudden, we get our sovereignty violated. And what kind of message does it send to the world? So there are those people out there, okay, so Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons and they were attacked and now being killed. But we all need probably to develop nuclear capabilities. So now, as an aspiration to develop nuclear capabilities is so strong, especially in all those authoritarian type of countries who don't yet have it, right? Like North Korea, for instance, right? Or they claim they do. We don't know what's the level of it. But at the end of the day, it's also about the message which happened about the arms race. You've seen the surge in defense budgets for different countries, right? But I think this war has really sparked a major arms race globally, right? Everybody realized that their defense capabilities are very limited. If Australia is invaded tomorrow, how are you going to defend yourself? I mean, that's a question that, you should be thinking about. And how many people are ready to fight for Australia, for instance? It's kind of, I was told it's not a politically correct question to ask it in Australia. But at the end of the day, 10 years ago, somebody asked me, Would Russia ever invade Ukraine? I would say, no, it's impossible. And then it became possible. And I think in today's world, to paraphrase Adidas, impossible is nothing. Look, everything is possible, to be frank. As we move on, the world is changing. In 20 years from now, half of the world will be a desert. And there will be 2 countries which have 2 billion people out there, and they will need water and food. So there will be lots of wars because of the access to clean water. And that's unfortunate, but look, there are so many issues to discuss. I better shut up here. It was more kind of an opening remarks and sort of things, but look, I'm very, keen to hear what you're going to say on the subject matter for me to comment, but I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
And on that note, I'd like to call upon Professor Kroc to speak to us about Australia's response to the refugees in 2022.
Thank you very much, Tamer. Your Excellency, it's an honour for us to have you with us today. And I think that the questions we have after this will be superb to draw you out further in your reflections on what's happening in the world, but also in Australia. Thank you also to Professor Trapp for an absolutely masterful summary of the huge array of cases that have been brought into international law, the significance for international law of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. It's so important that we have devoted the whole of this morning's conference to it, and I think that's well deserved. One of the things that really struck me, though, listening to Professor Trapp, was the effort that countries are going to engage with international law in all of its myriad facets. And I acknowledge also the work of your colleague, Professor Philippe Sols, who is an extraordinary human in the work that he has done around genocide. Over summer, I've been reading his book, East-West Street, which came out in 2015, of course, but it's really got me thinking about why are we so engaged with Russia's aggression in Ukraine? Part of it for me comes from immigration, that after World War II, we've had Ukrainians literally going all over the world. There's a huge population in Canada. We have a large population here as well. So I think these events have touched us in ways that we don't always understand. And so what I'm going to do now is to, in sympathy with this morning's theme, I'm going to begin by examining the situation of Ukrainian nationals forced abroad as a result of hostilities at home. Then I'm going to look at Australia's treatment of refugees from other countries, really to emphasise the massive variations that exist in the way we respond to individuals who are fleeing different conflicts in different parts of the world. And inevitably, Your Excellency, politics is totally messed up in this and how we respond to it. I think one of the questions I'll have for you when you respond after this is really to reflect. You sort of touched on the extent to which Ukraine's become a bit of a proxy war for the clash of civilizations and titans as Russia tries to get back to an old world order that possibly never existed anyway. Okay, I'm going to begin by I did have some slides here. Hi, Ash. Look, I'm going to begin just by pointing out to everyone, I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer. Ironically, or interestingly, most of the people fleeing Ukraine won't meet the international legal definition of refugee, for the simple reason that they still have an incredibly powerful country advocating for them. At the same time, Australia, like many other countries, have has responded with great generosity to Ukraine, to Ukrainians forced abroad. So I want to make the point first that in immigration law, Australia has a program to admit migrants, and as part of that program, we choose to admit individuals on humanitarian grounds. Most of the Ukrainian refugees that we talk about, in fact, are coming into the country first and foremost as humanitarian migrants who we recognise are in need of protection because they can't be where they want to be. They can't be at home. So a simple point I make here is that the humanitarian part of our program is voluntary. It has nothing to do with obligations under international law. Not to say that as a question of morality and politics and every other thing we shouldn't be doing it, but there's only one group of people whom we actually owe protection obligations, and these are individuals who either meet the convention definition of refugee or who meet the other non-refoulement, French word for don't send me back, obligations that have been developed under other human rights instruments. We're party to all of them, not so much to the Genocide Convention. We've only signed that with respect to behaviour overseas. And in fact, a lot of things that are happening this year speak to why we didn't do that. So what have we done for the Ukrainians displaced by the war? There are millions of them. In fact, we haven't seen the number of people displaced this large since the civil war in Syria. We have given direct assistance to Ukraine of over 580 million and counting. And I think Your Excellency knows about that and has been playing a pivotal role in advocating for Ukraine in trying to get Australia to be more generous and to join with the other members of the coalition that we align with. We have so far granted 9,500 visas to individuals in Ukraine. We brought 4,500 out here. We have offered temporary protection to anyone who asked for it between February last year and the 31st of July. Questions have been asked of the new government. Why suddenly have you stopped granting temporary protection to anyone who asks for it? And the response has been, oh, well, just seek asylum as refugees. So they've been, anybody else who has come after that date has automatically been granted bridging visa with work rights sometimes. And they've been encouraged to apply for a permanent protection visa. As I said before, that would be done on grounds of humanitarian need rather than on meeting the convention definition requires you to show that you don't have a country who will assist you when you are persecuted or can't assist you when you're persecuted. So I just wanted to contrast that with the way that we have treated fugitives from Afghanistan. And I have a former student in the room who has been deeply involved with me. I'm a practitioner as well as an academic. So really interested in the discussion this morning about, the emotion in international law, but I'm actually a very practical person. So I've been involved with Ukrainians. I was hoping that two of my Ukrainian clients were going to be here for this session. I'm hoping they'll get here by lunchtime. But I've got dirty hands in the Afghan space as well. So the fall of Kabul in 2020, I think, was one of the most excoriating events experienced by Western allies in that country since probably the fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War. And I was part of an international effort that worked across the US, Canada, Belgium, we had actually judges in this country who were communicating because of our iPhones, communicating with female judges in Kabul and actually shepherding them out of the country was an extraordinary experience. We have allocated 10,000 places to Afghan nationals within the offshore humanitarian program since 2021-22. And there are an additional 6,500 places for Afghan nationals that will be delivered over the next 4 years, which represents about 4,000 odd places per year between 2022 and 2026. Last year, however, we actually brought in more than we advertised, so 5,326. That will bring total number of places available to Afghan nationals to 31,000, which is quite generous, I think, in terms of our size. 26,500 under the humanitarian program and 5,000 under the humanitarian stream. However, I said I practice in this area. Last year, I ran a specialist accreditation exam for practitioners across Australia, and I set this as one of the exam questions. Outline the permanent visa options, processing mechanisms and appeals available to Afghan nationals in Australia in each of the following scenarios, as at the 1st of August 2022. You can assume that they all want to stay in Australia permanently. A, person who arrived in Australia by boat without a visa in July 2013. B, came to Australia on a diplomatic visa in 2019. C, was evacuated to Australia from Kabul in 2021 and was granted a 449 humanitarian stay visa. And D, was recognised as a convention refugee in Nauru and later transferred to Australia on medical grounds. Now, I can supply full answers to anyone who's interested. You may be interested to know that of nearly 50 candidates last year, 2 got all of the questions correct. All you need to know is that Afghans in categories A and D remained on rolling temporary visas or in a state of literal suspended animation with no rights to any kind of visa and no clear fix on what was going to happen to them or when. And they've been in that situation for 10 years. Only the diplomat and the evacuee had anything like access to a clear future in Australia. As of Sunday evening of this week, on the 12th of February, the Minister announced that anyone who came to Australia by boat before December 2013 would gain a pathway to permanent residence through the grant of a resolution status visa. That is going to help about 19,693 of 31,000 odd people. So it's still a problem. We still have a large cohort of people who have been caught in a political web. It's the best way that I can describe it. For those who now are able to apply and get permanent residence, they will have access to Social Security, National Disability Insurance Scheme, higher education assistance. The other thing that happened over the last weekend is that the previous government policy of deprioritising any person who had come by boat from being able to sponsor family members was also abolished, which means that these people are now going to be able, after 10 years, you go out into the community and you talk to these people who are just skeletons of humans. They show you a photo of their children and say, I haven't seen them for 10 years. It is excoriating, it really is. Finally, they're going to be able to sponsor their families and get on with their lives. But the problem is that we've still got a legacy caseload. We still have the people who have been told you will never settle in Australia. Some of these people are in this situation literally because of the position they were standing on a particular day in a particular queue. 7:30 Report over on Monday night, I think it was, had an interview with 2 young women whose parents were in Australia who are now on the pathway to permanent residence because they were medevaced. They were sent to Nauru and medevaced back. One of them's just been accepted into law at Newcastle University. So we have unfinished business in this country, and it's all about politics. I'm a practitioner. I have acted for people, for children orphaned in boat crashes. I don't like people on boats. I don't want to encourage anyone to get onto a boat. I think we can do that, though, without this absolutely grotesque inhumanity. Here's the thing. We are in breach of so many aspects of our international legal obligations when we do this. Let me just finish by making some comments about changes that we have seen with the change of government in May last year, because I don't want to mince my words here. I think the change of government really is and has the potential to change this country. What we need to do, though, is we need to really convince our new government to take courage and to believe again in international law, and to make us proud again that we're complying with international law. One of the big changes that I've seen since last year is I can now tell you how many people have come by boat, have come, et cetera, et cetera. The first thing the Conservative government did in 2014 when they were elected was to shut down the shipping news. You couldn't find out anything about what was happening at all. Again, now we can. The government is open and is telling us what is happening. Yes, it's maintaining Operation Sovereign Borders, and I personally actually think they need to do that. But we also need to actually own up to the fact that the world at the moment has never seen more people displaced than at any other time in history. UNHCR, the United Nations charged with looking after refugees, now estimates that over 100 million people are forced migrants on the move, either domestically or internationally, and in need of assistance. The same is true of our region. We've had genocide in our region, and I think this will be a topic for next year's year in review when we look at the Gambia and processes in Myanmar. In 2014, we saw the Migration Act amended to remove all references to international law conventions. Instead, we codified elements selectively, codified elements of the Refugee Convention and of the other human rights conventions. You still have the words non-refoulement in the Migration Act. But we have section 197C, which says that for the purpose of removing someone from Australia, non-refoulement obligations shall not be relevant considerations. I just want to finish by very briefly touching on, for me, one of the absolute running sores in Australia's engagement with international law. That is the relationship between our non-refoulement obligations and what's known as crimmigration law. These are migrants, non-citizens, no matter how long they've been here, if they're not citizens, they commit a serious crime, they can and they will be removed from the country. But there are many who came as refugees or who literally are refugees in the sense that if you send them back to the country, they will be persecuted, they will be killed, right? But they've committed a crime here. Unfortunately, because of the politics and the pressure surrounding international law and the decision by the politicians to strip the Migration Act out of it, Conservative High Court, High Courts tend to be conservative, in a case called M1 of 2022, ruled that unenacted international non-refoulement obligations cannot be and are not mandatory relevant considerations under the Migration Act, attracting judicial review of jurisdictional error. They are not part of Australia's domestic law. What does it mean in practice? It means that we have had individuals from Sudan, by the way, many of whom have committed crimes because they've got psychosocial disabilities. So you've got a nice intersection there between the CRPD, other elements of human rights law, and refugee law and criminal law. They've been in detention because some of them literally cannot be removed from the country for 6 years, 8 years, 11 years and counting. Hey guys, we need to do better. And I think we need to encourage our new government to re-engage with international law so that we can all feel proud again. Thank you.
So all our panelists have finished early, which I'm going to take 100% credit for, which leaves us at around 15 minutes for questions. Does anyone have, and I will, does anyone have any opportunity now?
Thank you very much for some very stimulating presentations on the situation in Ukraine and Russian aggression and all the other many consequences of it. Just a question, I'm not sure, maybe for you, Mr. Ambassador, or for Kimberly perhaps, about one of the other proposals. I think you mentioned one that Philippe Sands is behind, a tribunal, which I understood to be about potential criminal prosecutions, but I'm also wondering about the proposal for a claims type commission to afford reparations to those harmed, to Ukraine and Ukrainian nationals who have suffered loss because of Russia's aggression, which I understand is being led by a group at Columbia University in New York. There may be governments involved sort of behind the scenes, but I think at least on its face, it's a private sector or university-led initiative. Given that there's been, given the sanctions that have been imposed by the international community and billions, I don't know what the final or current figure is, probably changing on a weekly basis, of assets of the Russian state and oligarchs that have close connections with Putin's regime. Billions of assets have been seized by various governments around the world, and there is work underway to develop some kind of claims commission, which might follow a model of the Iran-US Claims Tribunal or the United Nations Compensation Commission that was created in the wake of the first Gulf War in 1990-91. If there are any reflections on prospects for that coming to fruition, any recent developments that you may or may not be aware of, and whether that is something that the Ukrainian government is behind the scenes or overtly supporting that initiative. Thank you very much.
Look, we don't really need Russian cooperation on the sovereign assets which are brought, in my opinion, and Ukraine calls for the establishment of the International Register of Damages, basically for, where we can collect evidence of the Ukrainians who suffered because of the Russian aggression, and for a compensation mechanism which will be established. And there are also Russian private citizens, which makes it a bit more complicated, who are closely linked to Putin and his to the family, who pretty much carry his money. It's not their money, and they have their assets globally, including here in Australia, by the way. And so it will be it's a bit complicated because it just goes from international law to domestic law, right, and private property issues. But there are two different elements. There are sovereign assets, which are owned by the Russian state, and there are those oligarchs or kleptocrats, Russian kleptocrats, who became rich because of Putin, right? And how do we take a hold of it? The damages, we estimate that Russia's damages to Ukraine are now around $750 billion. If you take that our GDP before war was $200 billion, we're talking about now already 3 years of Ukraine's GDP before war for the reconstruction and rebuild, right? And of course, there is a different element of all the atrocities and war crimes which have happened, right? How do we compensate for that, right? if you were tortured and raped, and how do we compensate that, right? How do we actually compensate the fact that the entire nation is traumatized by the war, and how many generations will have to pass before we get over it, if ever, right? And that's a little bit more complicated. It's kind of intangible, but it's out there. But there must be definitely a mechanism. And as you know, many countries, UN member states, have supported, on the 14th of November, they supported the UN General Assembly resolution on the furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine. And on February 15th, just actually yesterday, EU, within the Coreper number 2, approved the establishment of an ad hoc working party on the use of frozen and immobilized Russian assets to support Ukraine's reconstruction. So it's already in motion. It's happening now, and it's important we get more governments part of it, right? So therefore, it's one of those things. Also, from an international, here's another comment which is not specifically related to this, but just something that needs to be discussed in forums like this and academic circles. Russian seat as a permanent member in the UN Security Council, it's a big issue, right? As you know, there were 3 nations which were founding members of the United Nations from the Soviet Union. One was the Soviet Union, Union of Socialist Republics. The other one was Ukrainian Socialist Republic and Belarus Socialist Republic, going back to all the conferences which led to the establishment of the United Nations. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia assumed the seat of the Soviet Union. Nobody has ever voted. There was no legal mechanism for that. And at the end of the day, there is a legal issue here which needs to be addressed. And it's important for international lawyers, academia especially, to work on that. And Ukraine is questioning, actually, Russian seat as a permanent member of the Security Council. You may call me a dreamer, but that's what it is. We have to actually work on that. That's another matter. Speaking of the refugees, look, I'm not in a position to provide any comments on the refugees and your immigration policy. It's a matter of your domestic politics. But I mean, look, we have 5 million refugees who left Ukraine, who are now outside of Ukraine, 5 million, right? We have 1.5 in Poland, 1 million in Germany, over 100,000 in the UK, 70,000 in Ireland, the same spread out France, Italy, all European nations pretty much have taken a huge influx of the Ukrainian refugees, right? We have another 9 million internally displaced people, 9 million in Ukraine. So who had to leave cities in the east, in the south, and had to move central and western Ukraine, right? So imagine people of Sydney and Melbourne leaving in 2 weeks and moving out to Brisbane and Adelaide, right? Well, there is a housing problem here. I couldn't find a flat in Canberra for a month, and my deputy who just arrived was really desperate to find a place. So how can you actually move these people out of Sydney and Melbourne and make sure that they can have some sort of living in other cities of Australia, right? It would be a disaster here, right? But this is what's happening in Ukraine. And actually, the world has not seen it since the Second World War. Rick, the numbers we are having, at the times of Syria, we didn't have it. No, those were different numbers. I'm sorry. So there was we are going back to 1939 pretty much. This is when the Second World War started. So this is a totally different idea. Now, what's for us? We need these people back. My job is not to make the life of Ukrainians here comfortable. My job is to make sure they go back. To be frank. And look, and those people will go back. Not have many. Look. My statistics is that whatever visas were issued, only 6,000. So I have a 6,000 who arrived. I know many people who left already, who went back for different reasons. Some elderly people came to stay with their kids here. They stayed for half a year. If they don't come from the area where their house was destroyed, but there are people who come from Mariupol, Kharkiv, and other cities which don't exist anymore, right? Of course, they don't have anywhere to go, so they stay. But those people who came from other cities, which are more or less intact, though they're under attacks continuously, and they spend 6 months here, they don't speak the local language, they're in their late 60s, early 70s, and they all left. I mean, it just for them, it's difficult to adapt. They wouldn't learn the language. their kids here, they feel they are a burden for the children, they go back. Some younger people come, potentially could progress and then eventually become naturalized citizens. But again, look, those people who left Ukraine, they didn't leave Ukraine because all those labor migrants who left Ukraine, they left it 20 years ago. Those people had a decent life in Ukraine. They were forced to leave, mostly women with children, and then they had to go, right? There was a huge boost to the Polish economy because of this big influx of the Ukrainians. It was a major thing, Ukraine sent 15 billion euros last year to Europe through our banking system, because Ukrainians are paying, with their credit cards in Europe, and the money is transferred back to the EU. Huge, surge in real estate prices, and the economy is prospering. I'm sure Poland can even take more. They've lost many people when Poland joined the European Union. Of course, Poland's government was one of those who supports us so much, and that's actually was of huge help to Ukraine. But at the same time, we need these people back to work on the Ukraine's rebuild once we win the war, right? Now, how do we win the war? I mean, that's another question. And how can we achieve that? But look, I kind of understand, Professor Krok, your arguments on the immigration, and of course, different nations. And of course, Ukrainians still have a state, is still there. And look, every time I go, and I met most of these refugees because I've spoken to them in different cities many times, I always tell them one thing. These are women with kids primarily, right, as we see. So I tell them, look, you use it as an opportunity. Your children will learn English in 1 year or two when you go, and you can also learn English if you don't know it yet. It will be a huge advantage when you go back home, and there will be many more opportunities once we win the war, we join the European Union, and we start Ukraine's rebuild, and that's an aspiration, and that's what we want to achieve. So, my job is a bit different, though. Look, I mentioned it that, it would be good if there was, because that program that expired on the 31st of July, because I get lots of requests from the Ukrainians. Oh, will we get it back? And the government promises it will, but it never happens. They are now overhaul the whole immigration policy. We don't know how long it's going to take. So in a way, many people who got visas, they didn't even go here, because if you don't have any money and they come here on their own, with their own money, right? So it's not that the government is bringing them. So they have to buy a ticket. It's an expensive one now. If you have a family of 3, you need, and then you need some money to get by. And if there is no assistance coming from the Australian government, well, they probably just cannot afford it. Because I know cases when people came, they had this financial assistance initially, which helped them to kind of get by 3-4 months before they got a bridging visa, allowed them to work, found a job, and were phased out of this financial program, right? But that initial funding was essential for them to get adjusted, get the work permit, and then get a job, right? And many good cases like that.
I think we have time for one more question. Also, people online, if you want to ask a question. Any other? Is that someone raising their hand to sound?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Go, ask away. Bernard.
Oh, thank you. My question's through Professor Trapp to His Excellency the Ambassador. I wonder, as part of Ukraine's accession to the European Union, there'd be a lot of work still, wouldn't there, in the Ukraine acceding to international instruments. Professor Trapp mentioned that Ukraine has not yet made a declaration under Article 36 of the International Statute relating to the International Court. Could you comment, Ambassador, on where your country is going on acceding to important international instruments such as the statute for the International Court?
It's a good question, but to be frank, I don't have an answer for that, and I'm not going to provide it or improvise it. And so, but speaking of the European accession, well, it's a long way ahead. There is Copenhagen criteria, there is Maastricht criteria, a lot of negotiations to take place, a lot of reforms we need to take place. So we understand it's a long road ahead, but the fact that Ukraine was recognized as a candidate member state in June was a milestone, and a strong political message, but also something that we've been aspiring for a long time. When EU-Ukraine Association Agreement was signed, the one issue which was missing there, the line was the line that was missing in that whole thing was, of course, recognizing Ukraine as a candidate member and for the EU integration. But look, I'm sure that all other compliance issues will be addressed in due course when we're going to get to them. And we have to recognize and appreciate the fact that we are ready to open negotiations with the EU starting from this European autumn, right, at the time when we are still dodging the Russian missiles. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind and to be cognizant of that and just allow it some time.
Well, on that note, if
look-
we'd like to thank our panelists for a very informative panel.